Hey gang, welcome back. And in this video, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about one of the primary neurodevelopmental disorders, in this case, autism spectrum disorder. This is essentially a classification of symptoms resulting from essentially what many people are starting to describe as sort of a brain style, sort of a quirk of human evolution and development that is more or less atypical, but is not sort of intended to indicate that people with this brain style, these patterns of relating and behaving, not to preclude that they cannot be incredibly successful. In fact, the more you read and learn about autism spectrum disorder, the more you'll probably begin to recognize people who might meet criteria for the disorder in very successful positions around the world. We'll talk more about that toward the end of the video. But this is also a classification of symptoms and a sort of brain style manifestation. It's very near and dear to my heart. Early in my career, as I was just beginning as a professional counselor, a substantial part of my practice was working with people on the spectrum, doing home-based care, working in intensive sort of in-home sort of settings, supporting people, individuals on the spectrum and their families. So primarily they're typically developing parents and or siblings, cousins, whoever else was in the home, providing a wide range of care. So a couple things I want to make sure you're updated on. Excuse me. In the text, the gray text, there needs to be an update to sort of the prevalence. So most up-to-date prevalence numbers that I've seen from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention are 1 in 44 people are estimated to have been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. So that's way up from about the 1% that is alluded to in your text. And I've included sort of a chart on the Blackboard page for this set of disorders that shows sort of our rapidly increasing sort of prevalence and understanding of prevalence of autism spectrum disorder. There's all kinds of sort of speculation and hypotheses about why this is, ranging from sort of toxins in the environment, literally there's something in the water, to and probably more likely just an improved recognition and understanding and compassion for people with this sort of presentation. And so, there are many people who have been highly successful and functional, like, for example, Albert Einstein, who may have been, if Einstein lived in this day and age, may have been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder early in his life because he didn't have language until he was 3 years old. That's about a year or two at least delayed from what is more common in terms of language development. People typically develop language between 10 months and a year. All that to say, just be aware that you are very likely to know somebody on the spectrum, and it's important to also recognize that once you've met one person on the spectrum, you've met one person on the spectrum. The combination of these factors is often so varied that it's very difficult to really kind of nail down what to expect from a person on the autism spectrum. And so it's very important to kind of just remain person-centered and accept sort of individualized differences along the spectrum. I think that's partly why it's so valuable to have a more spectrum sort of framework for autism, as opposed to, just less than 10 years ago, when prior to DSM-5 being first published, when it was not considered sort of, or at least the discussions of autism did not involve discussions of a spectrum. Now, as you've read, autism spectrum disorder has two primary criteria that must be met for a diagnosis to be made. So, key features include criterion A, which is persistent difficulties in social communication and interactions, and criterion B, which is sort of an enduring patterns of restricted and repetitive behavior. Now, for criterion A to be met, all three of the following criteria must be present. So there must be difficulties with social emotional reciprocity. This could show up as sort of atypical social approach. So a person upon first meeting, whether it be the first time you ever meet them or the sort of subsequent meetings, they may get up into your space and lean in, maybe looking at you and addressing you in ways that are not what you're used to. We'll talk a little bit more about why that might be here in a second. The subcriteria 2 is difficulty with nonverbal cues. So this may be sort of showing up as atypical eye contact, difficulties with understanding communicative intent. So people may not necessarily be able to decipher what tone of voice means, what hand gestures may mean, and things of that nature. And obviously that leads to oftentimes great difficulty because the vast majority, in fact, I think the last numbers I've seen is like 93% of the messages we send back and forth as neurotypically developing people, 93% of that communication is nonverbal. So just keep that in mind. And then thirdly, for criterion A to be met, there must be also difficulties with developing, maintaining, and or even understanding the purpose of or the functioning of interpersonal relationships. So that's criterion A, difficulties with social emotional reciprocity, difficulties with understanding and responding to nonverbal cues, and difficulties with developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships. Now, criterion 2, enduring patterns of restricted repetitive behavior. 2 of the following 4 criteria must be met. So there must be some type of stereotyped motor movement. So this could show up as sort of the use of atypical use of objects or speech. Could also show up as like sort of self-stimulating behavior. So whether it be sort of spinning or maybe some flapping of the hands, things of that nature. Could also show up as vocal tics, lining up toys, those types of things. The second subcriteria is insistence on sameness, sort of inflexible routines and ritualized patterns of behavior. Subcriterion C is sort of intensely focused interests, so that there may be one or just a few other topics or ideas or activities that a person is so into that they really have a hard time tolerating any other activity. And this can lead to difficulties with sort of just basic daily functioning. Maybe they don't go to sleep because they can't stop focusing on what they're interested in. They don't participate in hygiene. They may refuse to go to school, may refuse to go to work, those types of things. That can impair their ability to interact with and succeed in the world as it is currently designed. And then fourthly, there may be hyper or hypo sensitivity to environmental sensory input. So this may look like difficulty with everyday noises. Something as simple as the sound of my voice may affect someone like sort of hands on or fingernails on a chalkboard for a person on the spectrum. There may be difficulty with just basic lights. So a person may have a great difficulty going into a grocery store where there are big overhead fluorescent lights that for typically developing people are tolerable, but for a person on the spectrum or just for a person within other classes of the or categorizations of the neurodevelopmental class, they may see flickering, they may have difficulty looking at computer screens for the same reason, and these things are just really intolerable. They're so distracting that it's hard to stay focused on the task at hand. This is also true for like smells, like walking through a produce section may be completely overwhelming for a person on the spectrum, not to mention walking through the floral section. And so this also may show up in like clothing preferences. So a person on the spectrum may have such great difficulty with tactile information that they may refuse to wear t-shirts with tags, or they may have a really rigid preference for wearing sweatpants. And so, this often will conflict with social norms that may just add layers of difficulty to a person on the spectrum, whether they are a child or an adult. So it goes across the lifespan. So those are the two primary criteria. Difficulties with social emotional reciprocity in relationships, as well as enduring patterns of restricted and repetitive behavior. There must be all three criteria, sub-criteria met for criterion A, and 2 out of the 4 must be met for criterion B. Next is kind of where the spectrum comes in. So there's different levels of severity on the impact. So level 3 is sort of requiring very substantial support. People that land in this specifier are likely to require specialized school or high levels of accommodation in the workplace. They may need home-based aids or other services. They may have very little to no functional communication, especially around spoken language. They may be considered sort of nonverbal. It may require sometimes elaborate augmentative and alternative communication systems, whether it be sort of a picture exchange system, which is more of an analog system, or something that's based on an iPad or another type of device. And so these are folks who may also require residential and or acute psychiatric care at times to help manage the symptoms of autism. Level 2 is requiring substantial support. So these are folks who will have less frequent and intense difficulties as level 3, but may also have great difficulty with spoken language, may also need sort of specialized school. They may have more success in sort of a mainstream setting, whether it be at school or at work, but are likely to need some assistance. So whether maybe they have aides at school or they have a sort of a job coach through the Department of Rehabilitative Services of their respective state. Those types of things. And then level 1, requiring support. These are people who are likely to do well in more mainstream classes or workplaces. They will, with few, if any, special accommodations. That isn't to say that they would not benefit from them, and they are more likely to be able to advocate for themselves. And they can typically thrive with some educated but relatively basic family and or community support. There are additional specifiers, including with or without accompanying intellectual impairment, and with or without accompanying language impairment. It's important to note, especially when it comes to assessing a person's intellectual impairment when they are on the spectrum, that some of the features, especially when it comes to verbal processing of autism, make it difficult to accurately assess at times full-scale IQ. So a person who maybe has a very slow response time to questions or tasks or instructions in a classroom or work setting, people may get the wrong idea about them. Either A, that they are not intelligent, when in fact they are very intelligent, or that they are being defiant, when in fact they are just taking more time to respond. And as you can imagine, this has an impact on sort of home, school, and community. A person who is perhaps in danger and a first responder shows up may be slow to respond to prompts from the first responder, and the first responder may be vulnerable to misinterpreting that as defiance, and then this has led to unfortunate situations with people on the spectrum, and the need for improved education about sort of what to expect from a person on the spectrum when it comes to law enforcement and other types of first response. So, you've read all about this stuff, right? Now, boy, is it hard without live experience to really put flesh on the skeleton of criteria. So let me do my best to kind of present that to you a little bit. Now, I have here on the board a couple of examples from my own personal and professional experience. So the first one is David here. Of course, not David's real name. David was my first client on the spectrum, and we were, he was referred to our care for a variety of different reasons we'll get into in a second, but I want to make sure that we start with just naming some of his assets. So David loved to jump on the trampoline, and he loved squeezes and those types of things. So one of the things that we made sure to incorporate into our work was, and he was very fortunate to have access to a trampoline at his residence. And so we would go out, first thing I would show up, he would say, "Jump me, please." And we'd go out to the trampoline, get on, and he would lay down on the trampoline. And boy, I got my workout really early on in the work with him at every session. And I don't know if you can see, you can't really see the lower part of my body, but essentially I would just sort of, I wouldn't jump, but I would vibrate, I would create waves on the trampoline, and he would fly up in the air and fly up in the air and fly up in the air, and would just laugh and laugh. It was the most heartwarming and adorable experience, especially given that you could see this side of him, but also noting that he had a tendency for very intense and dangerous aggressive outbursts. He was known for sort of causing destruction in the environment. So one of the things that was really problematic was that one of his sensory sort of interests was picking at and digging holes in drywall. So there's in the family home, there were all kinds of holes in the wall that if say a person from Child Protective Services had been called, they might go in and see that and have really strong suspicions about this child's welfare, when in fact this child was not being hurt at all. This was sort of a intensely focused interest / sensory input sort of manifestation. One of the other things that David loved was Fruit Loops. So if he sat down with sort of a grocery aisle full of boxes of Fruit Loops, he would be in heaven. And so this is sort of a manifestation of sort of a very strong sensory concern for him, and it also led to his restricted diet led to very sugary calories, and his pediatrician was very worried about his weight, because at 10 and even younger he was weighing over 100 pounds and was not really able to get adequate exercise to maintain a developmentally appropriate / healthy weight. There was lots of concerns about heart conditions and things of that nature. Now, we'll get into a little bit more about that in a little bit when we talk about medicine for David. There was also sort of features of he would often rock. He'd be sitting on the couch and doing some rocking, and you would hear sort of echolalia. So what that sounds like is he would hear maybe a sound in the room, and he would parrot it. That kind of sounded like a bit of a vocal tic. There was also sort of a preference for nakedness. Boy, if David could be allowed to run around without clothes on, that would have been his preference. There was lots of great difficulty getting him dressed in the morning because of sensory concerns. And one of the things that would show up here too, we mentioned aggressive behavior, he would often self-injure. He hit himself. Poor guy had lots of bruises on his legs because of the hitting. Again, leads to suspicion perhaps from a mandated reporter, when in fact the bruising was self-induced, and the child was not really in. He was being well cared for under the circumstances, and so it's also, I think, there was sort of troubles with and fears of elopement. So eloping is sort of running away. He required substantial support getting on and off the school bus. I remember one time he eloped from my car while I was transporting him back and forth from a sort of special needs baseball activity. So it required, as you can see, this young person would have landed most likely in level 3, requiring substantial support. In addition to that, even though he had a very supportive mother, he also had 2 younger siblings in the home, which he often put in danger. And mother's boyfriend, or fiance, who would have been eventually David's stepfather, had great difficulty sort of understanding and managing and effectively intervening in David's behavior to maintain safety for himself and others. And because of the difficulties with safety, it was often the case that David required some higher level of care. So there were times during my work with him that he required residential treatment for a substantial, series of weeks, sometimes months, and there was also a few acute hospitalizations to help regulate behavior, work with medicine, and maintain safety. Now, psychopharmacology, coming back to that, it's important to recognize that there is not a drug that is specifically targeted for autism itself. Now, there are a variety of different drugs that have been identified as having assistive properties for people on the spectrum, especially drugs like risperidone and Depakote that are typically used for antipsychotics or mood stabilizers. They have positive effects on aggressive behavior and impulse control, but they have oftentimes very concerning adverse side effects. So, for example, in David's case, he had been prescribed risperidone, which one of the primary concerning side effects is increase in appetite, which was contributing to his weight gain. Oftentimes parents who are working with or have a child on the spectrum with this level of severity are forced to make very difficult decisions regarding sort of the risks and benefits of medication. In David's case, and in another case that I'm familiar with, a colleague had a child on the spectrum who would have landed in level 3 of severity. Oftentimes parents are making the choice between, can my child live with me, or must my child go to a sort of more secure and regularly supported sort of outside institution. And oftentimes parents are willing to make the choice of, I will have my child take the medication to manage their behavior, and we will find ways to deal with the side effects in other ways. So part of our work with David was expanding his palate, working with sort of improving openness to foods other than sort of the sweet, crispy foods. He also had a preference for graham crackers. We were working with him on having some yogurt. He did not like soft and creamy. And also introducing vegetables, including like edamame or peas or things like that, that would have gotten some other nutrients into his body. So that's sort of a snapshot of David. Now, on the other side of the spectrum is Brooks. So Brooks is the guy that I'm currently working with, of course not his real name. I've been working with Brooks on and off for about 5 years or so. Guy loves Star Wars. Okay, this is the kid who shows up to my office for an appointment on May the 4th wearing his Jedi robes and carrying his lightsaber. He also loves campy jokes and perhaps going along with this, sort of questioning illogical social norms. this guy is and both of them really, were very easy to love. And it just so it turns out that some of the difficulties that Brooks has and has had were overcome through parents being supportive and also having means to go to advanced diagnostic services, be able to afford more regular and more intensive treatment with more highly skilled workers. Keep in mind, I was right out of grad school working with David. Brooks is in a condition where he was working more closely with people who were licensed, had doctoral degrees and things of that nature. Worked at Johns Hopkins University, which is again in a different state from where he lives, but the parents had means to take off work and make the transportation up there. So Brooks was slow to develop language, had a history of tantrums. That being said, those things have been essentially extinguished. He certainly has very strong spoken language these days, and has very few tantrums. He's vulnerable to depression. Perhaps the tantrums start to look a little bit more like sort of very negative, very intense self-talk. At times he makes sort of vague sort of comments about that could be interpreted as suicidal threats, like talking to his mom about, why did you even have me? Why am I here? There's no purpose in life. And oftentimes those will be responses to, he's got to go to an after-school activity and he doesn't want to go to it, or he's 15 now, so they're starting to introduce driving. So when he's faced with a challenging task, his tendency is to be very self-deprecating and to lose hope. So, and oftentimes too, one of the things that can be frustrating when working with Brooks is that he will steer the conversation into one of his intensely focused interests, and it's difficult to help him maintain focus. You have to kind of be skillful about sort of flowing with him and then flowing back to the topic at hand. Oftentimes it's with his mother in session, and they are negotiating some type of plan for overcoming some present challenge. So, all that to say, Brooks thrives in a mainstream high school environment in the public school system. This is in part because his parents, especially his mother, fought very hard with the school system when Brooks was young to make sure that accommodations in education and sort of a accepting and understanding environment was present for Brooks and then of course subsequently other children. But he certainly thrives. The reason he came back to counseling the most recently was that he was having difficulty with anxiety around participating in the school play. Probably less likely that David would be participating in a school play. Brooks had not only was he a part of the tech team, but he had a small part in the play where he got to wear a costume and make a very clever joke. And so that was very well received. So Brooks would land probably more in the level 1 category of severity. Now, somewhere between 1 and 3, might be where it falls a familiar name to you, potentially. This is Dr. Temple Grandin. So Dr. Grandin is famous for a couple different things. Number one, she is a very, very successful professor and researcher in animal science. If you're not familiar with her, she's written several books about animal science, especially as it relates to the compassionate care of beef cattle and other food animals. More than half of the slaughterhouses in the United States use a system that she created that compassionately sort of helps cattle this sounds a little bit morbid, but it helps cattle to the slaughter. It's really interesting, just a quick aside, interesting to hear her talk about animal rights and compassionate care. She talks about it in very logical terms, very practical terms about, the beef industry is not going away, so let's find a way to make this as suffering free as possible for the cattle. That being said, she also is famous for the way in which, and perhaps she was one of the first, if not the first, to write about and speak about the autistic experience in a way that was digestible and understandable for a wider, more typically developing audience. Her book, Thinking in Pictures, was published in 1995, which of course was right about 20 years before the publication of DSM-5, which for the first time incorporated a wider range of criteria that included the sensory concerns. And she has made contributions that have led to much wider understanding, much wider acceptance, and much wider effective support for people with the autistic brain style. So, all that to say, there's no way for you to kind of witness the experience of David or Brooks, but you can go to YouTube, and there are a whole host of TED Talks or other videos from Colorado State where Dr. Grandin is a professor, of her talking about her experience as an autistic person, and you'll get a sense about how she meets the criteria for autism spectrum disorder. There's also an excellently done, award-winning movie that was first released in 2010, starring Claire Danes of Homeland fame, and for those of us of a certain age, My So-Called Life fame, that is available on HBO Max if you have access to that. It's also rentable for low cost on like Amazon Prime or other platforms. And this is a film that has been endorsed by Dr. Grandin and does a lovely job of kind of conveying an accurate experience of a person on the spectrum. So that's kind of where I would guide you. If you're looking for more sort of ways to witness or get sort of a felt sense of what it's like to encounter someone on the spectrum, I would highly recommend looking at resources from the Autism Self-Advocacy Network, or ASAN. I put a link in Blackboard about ASAN that takes you to their page. This is an organization, a nonprofit organization that is run by people on the spectrum, for people on the spectrum, and you can get information from the source. I highly recommend information from them and other organizations that are self-advocacy type organizations. That isn't to say that other organizations that are run by perhaps more neurotypical people don't have valuable contributions to make, but I like to go to the source whenever possible. So that concludes sort of our video about autism spectrum disorder. Look forward to hearing more from you about your thoughts, questions, concerns on the discussion board, and look for you next time in a video about ADHD.